It's always a good week when you get a call from the OPEC Whisperer. Hey, I'm going to be in Houston. And so that was cool. You were kind enough to call. So what was the thing we did last night?
Well, we had a little reception for people to learn about this charity called All Hands and Hearts that rebuilds schools and homes in areas of natural disasters. And I have been on the board for almost 20 years. It was founded by Petra and Nemcova, founded Happy Hearts. And then we had a merger with All Hands in 2017. And Jess, our executive director, is here today too.
Yeah, no, that was really cool because I hadn't heard of the organization.
That's crazy because we were in Houston for, I think, almost 5 years. I mean, rebuilding homes.
Yeah. And Petra's a model?
Supermodel.
Supermodel. So give me that.
She's a supermodel, actually.
So give me that backstory.
So Petra was in the tsunami in 2000.
Oh, let me do this real quick. Listeners, we're going to make her talk oil in just a little bit, but this was really cool. This was really cool last night. So I want you guys to hear about this first.
In 2000, was it 4 or 5?
4.
2004, the tsunami in Thailand. Petra was there on vacation with her fiance, and they got caught in the tsunami. Her fiance Simon died in the tsunami, and Petra ended up in a tree and broke her pelvis in 5 places and was rescued like 2 days later or something by a farmer that was, going by with a cart and got her to the hospital. So she started this charity 2 years later. She really wanted to think about how to help places rebuild after a natural disaster. And she was doing things up until then, but officially launched Happy Hearts a couple of years later and started rebuilding schools around the world. So we've been active a lot of times when there's a natural disaster. So many buildings will be damaged. So in the Philippines, for example, after the typhoon, there's an estimate that 6,000 schools were damaged. So it'll take our lifetime, unfortunately, to rebuild those 6,000 schools. In Nepal, where we're also rebuilding, there's 1,800 schools that still need to be rebuilt. So we're rebuilding schools in areas of natural disasters and also rebuilding homes where we can, mostly through volunteers. So we take big groups of volunteers and we teach them how to put a roof on or muck and gut, and we rebuild. And so that's what we were doing in Houston. We were in Houston for, again, 5 years after the hurricane. And I went down one weekend. We had a board meeting in Houston, and I was in this house working with this woman that was probably in her late 80s. And after the hurricane, people had come and helped her get the water out of her house, but they had never done any remedial construction. So when we pulled up the floor, it was just full of mold, and she had been living in this for 2 years.
Right.
And so all of these people that, the FEMA money comes much later. And so all these people that don't have access to funding were living in these really unsafe conditions.
That's interesting because, one of the things I remember distinctly about Harvey was J.J. Watt setting up the foundation and spending a lot of time with Drew Brees, the New Orleans Saints quarterback, because they had the big hurricane. And just one of the things that was a big deal is you got to play the long game, and so JJ was like, we've raised a lot of money, but we're going to spend it, think over years as opposed to immediately. And so that's interesting. So Jess, were you in Houston?
Yeah. And it takes a long time. I think you see that cycle in the first couple of months. People often see some progress with the easier work that gets done, that initial cleanup work, perhaps. You see these big fundraisers that happen, but 6 months, 12 months, 18 months go by, the media attention goes away, and the people with the least resources still haven't seen any support. So as Kathleen says, we were there almost 5 years and completed more than 1,200 different job sites. So we're still today in Florida from Hurricane Ian, which the 2-year anniversary is coming up in September. And even talking about it last night with folks in Houston who would have experienced Hurricane Harvey, people just have no idea that the cycle goes on for so long.
One of the things you said interesting last night that I hadn't thought through is when a disaster happens, Kathleen, you were kind of alluding to it earlier, that schools get damaged, but just the long-term repercussions of having a school be damaged was crazy.
Yeah. You in the US, you can find children either in temporary classrooms in parking lots, which is not a great situation, or they get bussed out to other schools. So they get split from friends because they'll get distributed amongst a number of different schools, which can be really disruptive, adds time to the day, and all of those different things. And internationally, there's just no provision. So children can end up out of school for many years or in really informal situations. And so when you're trying to get away from a cycle of poverty, education is really important. And you can have education disrupted for 5 or 10 years in some of these communities. As Kathleen mentioned, we're working in Nepal. That earthquake was 9 years ago. And the latest estimate is that there's still 1,800 schools. And more than that, children who go back to school quicker are at less risk, not just from poverty, but from the circumstances of trafficking as well. So it's really important to try to shorten that gap between when the disaster happens and when people have a safe and appropriate place to go back to school.
I'm on the board of an after-school literacy program here in Houston, and one of the things you learn is literally one of the tightest correlations or predictive correlations on the planet is third grade reading rates and then incarceration rates 15 years later. I mean, tell me what the reading rate is today. That's how many prisons you have to build. I mean, it's literally that scientific, and it's crazy. So each one of you, I want to hear, how did you get involved? What kind of was the spark?
I knew Petra through some friends, but I also was lucky enough to grow up at Tudor. I worked at Tudor for almost 11 years, and Paul Jones started the Robin Hood Foundation, which is an amazing charity that helps other charities in New York City. So Petra had asked me to help her think through starting up this charity. And I was very negative about it and kept saying, like, the world doesn't need another charity. Go to the Red Cross, put your flag up, use economies of scale, don't start another non-for-profit. And she just smiled and she's like, okay. And then she came back the next year and she's like, okay, I built 3 schools. So do you want to help me? And I was like, well, there's better ways to do this, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, okay. And then she'd come back the next year and she'd say, okay, I built 6 more schools. And then finally she wore me down. And so I joined the board. So it's been almost 20 years.
Oh, wow. How'd you get roped in?
It is a story of amazing coincidence that I can only say that it was meant to be. I was an English teacher overseas in Asia, saved up some money and was living my best life, backpacking around. And I overheard 2 girls talking about it on a bus, the volunteer aspect. So I came up through the all hands side, started by David Campbell, also in response to the same tsunami. He was a businessman in communications, rustled up some money from his friends and thought, I'm sure there's something I could do. Showed up in Thailand, and there was a lot of people there saying, I want to help. There were big players there, and they would approach and say, can we help? And they would say, yeah, go home, take some training. In 6 months, you can come back. And they'd be like, but that guy over there looks like he needs a hand. So he rented a place, let people stay. They went out and did some work. He went home, thought it was a job well done, and then Katrina happened. So then he inaugurated the organization, and in 2017, they merged. So I heard about this volunteer opportunity, and I thought, that sounds fun. I'll go for a couple of weeks. It was amazing, and I thought, all right, I'll finish this program, and then I'll go back to the beach, and I'll feel like I've done a good thing. And then the earthquake in Haiti happened while I was there, and I thought, all right, I'll do that, and then I'll go back to the beach. And this is my 15th year.
Oh, nice. How long have you been executive director?
2 years this month.
Oh,
so I worked up as a volunteer through the programs, into operations, people, and then here. And more than 90% of our staff were volunteers first. So it's a life-changing, transformative opportunity to be able to act on that urge when you see something has happened and you think, I'd like to do something, and you can't figure out how or if you're going to be helpful. That's what we exist to do, so that you can just drop in and be useful.
It's true. My son was in college, and he took 15 fraternity brothers down to St. John to help rebuild there after the hurricanes. And they all came back and said, like, best thing I've ever done, life-changing. And hopefully it instills in them, that kind of desire to help and give back for the rest of their lives.
When we had Hurricane Harvey, one of the Kane employees, actually our CFO, house just got flooded. And, the key there was to get rid of all of the sheetrock inside the house because it's soaking wet and it winds up getting contaminated with mold, and that's game over on the house. So everybody at Kane and, a bunch of finance bros running around with power tools, maybe not the safest thing on the planet, but I made my kids go with me, and, they were carrying things around because it really does instill. I mean, there's a magic of living in this day and age. I mean, we're so blessed beyond any people that have ever been on the planet before. Mm-hmm. And I think we lose sight of that a lot. Mm-hmm. So it was cool.
Yeah,
I think
it really
we also
does.
Go ahead.
It just really just makes a big impression because there are so many people that are not living the same way that we live, and that are in unsafe homes and in unsafe circumstances, or not in homes at all. And, if you can do something to make that process for them to have a roof over their heads. I remember, I don't know if it was in Haiti or where it was, there was 3 generations living in the same family, and they didn't have a roof on the building. And, it was just a terrible story. And we went in there and rebuilt it.
Mm-hmm. And I think also, in addition to that, many of us nowadays, the work that we do every day is quite intangible. And part of the transformative experience is to do something very visible, very real. You go into that room with that moldy sheetrock and you take it out. You're not organizing someone else from your computer Zoom meeting to do that. You're actually there doing it. And not a lot of people have that day-to-day experience nowadays. So I think it is the experience of doing the work, the experience of meeting real people in those circumstances, not just through your TV screen, and the experience of participating directly in something that you can see has had such a positive impact.
So how do people help? If somebody's out there and kind of moved by this, what can they do to help? Obviously, cut a check. I mean, checks always are good. Somebody on a charity board, send a check. What else can they do to help, and how do they reach you?
They can sign up to volunteer. So if you go to our website, which is allhandsandhearts.org, you can click on the volunteer link, and it will show you all of the current programs that we have. So you can choose where you want to go from the list of places. The kind of person who has the time and motivation to go to Nepal maybe isn't the same person who has the time and energy to go to Florida. So you can make your selection, fill out an application form, and it's basically first come, first served. If we have a bed open when you want to come, you can come. If there's nothing that you can get to at the moment, then you can sign up for updates. And we'll send you an email every time we open a new program. And if you want to come to one, then you can sign up.
Nice. Do I need to have any particular skills?
It would be great if you could tile and roof. But if not, we'll still take you.
Yeah. We exist to lower the barrier to participate. So anybody can come down as long as you're willing to roll your sleeves up and get stuck in. You are responsible for getting yourself from where you are to where we are. And then after that, all of the tools and training and accommodation and food and all of that is provided for you by the organization. So we do encourage you to fundraise and participate on the financial side too, but it is open to everyone.
Oh, that's very cool. I have 3 Yates children that are living on the dole right now that may need need to do something constructive this summer. So
sounds like a perfect little 2-week spot for them, right?
Exactly.
2 weeks, 2 months, we'll take them.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's perfect. That's great. So I would be remiss.
I know.
Given that you're here.
There is a very interesting segue, though, because, we're moving from this El Nino to La Nina this year, and it's like a very rapid transition, which is unusual. And they say that this is going to cause the most hurricanes ever on record in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's obviously something very important for the oil markets, but also something that we're going to be, it's going to strain our capacity as well.
Oh, I didn't think of that.
So I think the newest forecast out of NOAA is like 33 hurricanes in the Gulf.
Oh, wow. That's a lot of hurricanes.
Pretty busy.
Yeah. Interesting. I always took the position at Kane is if we have a liability at the company, if we have some bank debt or we have signed a rig contract, let's hedge enough of our production to make sure we can pay that off. But outside of that, if we could predict oil and gas prices, we should do that instead of messing around with drilling wells and all. But one time, gosh, I forget even the hurricane name. One of the hurricanes unexpectedly strengthened and went through and just shut down all the platforms. And I remember gas spiked from 6 to 8 or something. We were like, we should just hedge a lot at 8. This sounds great. So, all right. So Vladimir, who is a police officer down in Richmond, Texas, next to maybe my mom, is my biggest fan. And he has been beside himself that I have not level set oil prices, what's going on with them, what's going to happen, and all that. And so he was so excited Monday morning. I go, Kathleen's coming on. Level set us. Where are we? Oil prices? What's going on?
Okay.
What do we need to be thinking about?
So I think that what you've seen this year has not been a geopolitical story. So when people talk about a $5 to $10 premium in oil coming from geopolitics, I think they're off base on that. I think it's much smaller than that. And obviously some of it just came out, whatever was in there after the de-escalation intentions that we saw last week. But what has been driving oil prices higher this last couple of months is a combination of much better demand than people expected. So everybody was looking at kind of average demand of 1.2, 1.3 million barrels a day. This year, I've been at 1.6, and I think I might be too low. So it looks like it's going to come in much better. It's not necessarily coming from the U.S., but nobody expects it to come from the U.S., and it's not necessarily coming from developed markets, but it's coming from developing markets. So China, India, Southeast Asia, South America, Middle East, all of that seems to be firing on all cylinders. So demand looks to be, even though you had, an unseasonably warm winter, you've seen even like gasoline demand in China, which is supposedly 30% EVs right now. Gasoline demand is surging. So there's something happening. Okay, so demand is better, and that kind of got us off to a good start for the year, and now supply is constrained. So the U.S. we're going to get the monthly data at the end of this month for February, and it's going to give us a little bit more clarity because the weekly data has been terrible lately. But, U.S. supply dropped a lot in January, as did Canadian supply on freeze-offs. And it hasn't come back. I mean, it's come back a little bit, but it hasn't gone back up to the highs that we saw at the end of last year. So why is that? Is there an issue in the Permian? Is it this parent-child issue that we all thought was coming before COVID? Is that really an issue now? You're just not seeing the return to the highs, which you should be able to pretty readily do. So something's happening. Then you have some issues in Mexico. You have a lot of these countries that are starting up these big refineries that are doing pipeline fill right now. So you're pulling more oil. You're not getting the products out of there yet. You will eventually get the products, but you've got Kuwait, you've got Nigeria, you've got Mexico starting up new refineries. So you're pulling more oil, less product. Then you have Russia, of course. So what I think is happening in Russia, and we felt very strongly that this was coming. It's just taken a while, but I was with a producer, a Russian producer last year, and he was telling me the first iteration of calling up new troops, we lose one person. The second round, we lose another person. The third and fourth round, then we're starting to lose key people. The first couple of people, we don't care so much. We can substitute away. Same thing for parts. The first time something breaks down, we can cobble together some parts from someplace else. Second time something breaks down, we have to take apart another machine and take the parts from there. Third time, we've got some issues and we've got to decide what to shut. So that's what you're seeing in Russia now. And the Ukraine is obviously accelerating that whole process because they're bombing refineries. And so they can't repair these refineries. They're telling you that they can, but they can't. And so, you can't believe any data that's coming out of Russia. And they're saying, don't worry, we're fine. Our, refining capacity is absolutely fine. It's not. You see all the time these comments from Novak telling domestic producers to increase product production because they're afraid of shortages in both gasoline and diesel domestically. And that's because you have these refinery outages and they're not being able to bring the capacity back online. So you're losing probably 500,000 barrels to 1 million barrels a day of refining capacity there. So you're going to see that oil come to the market. And that's a conflict because Russia has these OPEC commitments that they've said that they'll have production down by the end of June. So you have to watch that very carefully. If their exports are going up because they're not taking the oil and using it domestically in the refining system and instead exporting it, it's going to be, OPEC is not going to be happy about that. And as they're supposed to be cutting production right now. So their production still could be stable, but more of it's coming out to the export market. But production of products is definitely going down and it's not going to come back quickly. So you could have this perfect storm where their exports of oil come down to meet their quotas. Their exports of products are also coming down because they can't refine. And you've got outages elsewhere. You still don't have Iraq back. And, who knows, potentially you get more crackdown on sanctions with Iran. So you don't see the same kind of supply coming out of Iran. But supply is coming down. It's coming down because OPEC has been good about their sticking to their quotas, but it's also coming down because of unplanned outages. So demand is growing very strong. Supply has had a little bit of a hiccup here and the market is tightening. And you're seeing that in spreads. And so I think that you don't have to have Iran bombing Israel for oil prices to continue higher. However, I don't think we're going to $150. I think we're going, into the high 90s in Brent. Then we get to June 1st and we have to see what OPEC's going to do at that point. If you see in May, we haven't seen these inventory draws that we've all been expecting, but the time lag on transit and oil has lengthened so much because nobody's just going from, Russia to Europe. They're going from Russia all the way around to Africa to China or whatever. And so the time of transit has gone from 1 month to 2 months. So we just don't see the inventory moves as quickly as we used to. But we're not seeing draws right now, which we expected we would. So if we don't see them in May, OPEC is not going to add supply back on June 1st. And then it's going to be even tighter in the third quarter. If we do see May draw a lot, which I think you will, then OPEC will add something back on June 1st because you're going to need the oil.
Gotcha. So a couple of questions here real quick that I argue half-heartedly. I'm not gonna go full board on this, but I almost think that a geopolitical premium is just unjustified because, pardon the pun, but the market's just really liquid. You go put sanctions on Russia. All right, well, we'll just divert the tankers here. I mean, if you even think about it, back in World War II, we were getting barrels, even though the Nazi submarines were bombing ships, and it just feels like you can always get the oil if you need to. Now,
right. Plus the spare capacity that's available in OPEC. So
yeah,
unless you take, it really all depends on Iran, right? Unless you take Iran out of the market because their production's back up to 3.1, 3.2. Unless you take those exports out of the market, there's really nothing geopolitical that, Israel is not a producer. It's a small consumer. So that's not a big deal.
Yeah.
It all comes down to Iran.
Yeah.
Even Venezuela putting the sanctions back on was only about 100,000 barrels. They hadn't really increased that much.
Right. Yeah. They're a shit show.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
it's a technical term.
Yes, exactly. It's oil filled. It's oil filled. So, let's go to U.S. supply just real quick. I forget the hedge fund or the research fund firm that did it, but basically looked at the data, and the adjustment factors were getting ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we had 800, 900,000 barrels of adjustment.
Larger,
factors.
like 2 million barrels a day at the peak. It was crazy.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking ridiculous. That's almost 20% of U.S. production.
It makes the weekly data irrelevant.
Yeah. And so, but this one hedge fund, and I'm blanking on their name, we talked about it on BDE, actually went in and made several assumptions on the adjustments. And, if you look at the data, you see this in terms of supply, even though the freeze kind of happened in January, their data actually showed something looking more like this and already starting the trend down when you put their spin on what the adjustment should say. I mean, we've got to be maxed out, right? We just don't have that many rigs running. There hadn't been any efficiency gains and,
Well, there has been productivity gains. I mean, they definitely have. They've done more with less rigs, right? And we're out of ducks at this point, right? We've used all those up. There's no tier 1 acreage left to go after. So there can't be much more.
Yeah.
The adjustment factor, if you go to the monthly data, it, gets much better. So the monthly data is more, you can have more credible. But when they made these changes last year, it has been much better, although it just started to get funky again recently. But the weekly data actually is showing that now they're under-reporting or over-reporting production instead of under-reporting production. So to your point, it could be. There's something doesn't make sense about U.S. production. And we just did a piece the other day looking at rigs. And so normally, if you look at the change in the price of oil versus the change in the number of rigs, that the change in the price of oil is fairly predictive, but with a lag. So like if prices decline now, 3 months from now, rigs will start to decline, right? And that happened, right? We had a price decline at the end of last year where prices came off and rigs basically stayed steady. So I think there is some behavior by producers that are thinking this is going to tighten, whether it's because U.S. production is not going to grow as fast as people think, or it's because, demand, they feel like there's good demand. It's definitely export demand, right? And so they're just more optimistic, but they didn't respond the way that you would expect them to. They didn't drop rigs. Rigs just stayed pretty steady. So rigs should go up from here. It's just a question of how much capital discipline they're going to keep. And that's going to maybe show what producers are thinking. I mean, maybe it was, maybe last year was just all privates and not public, and it's hard to say, but it's hard to think that you're definitely not going to get anything like what you got last year. But the question is, are you ever going to get that again? And you're probably not. I mean, liquids growth, you get a couple 100,000. So maybe you get 400,000 this year, including liquids. But, it's hard. We had 1.5 million last year. That's a huge swing. And if demand keeps growing 1.5, you have to make that up from someplace, and nobody can do it.
Yeah, do you know Rory Johnston? He's a Canadian and does a lot of commodity research, particularly on oil. He came on the podcast. One of the interesting things I hadn't really thought of is he keeps saying everybody starts talking about pre-COVID numbers. Have we returned to pre-COVID and all that? And he goes, we actually don't know what COVID and the lockdowns really did to us. So what I think his point is, I think it's going to take 2 or 3 more years of just figuring out what is normal. Because we used to always say, it's 1.1 or 1.2 million barrels a day of growth. That's what it's been for the last 20 years. And so his point is there may have been something bigger that happened in the lockdown. And so that might be playing a role in things. The other interesting point I'll throw out is when you looked at U.S. well productivity, let's make this up, 2010 or 11, somewhere in there, to 2017, it was up 40% every year, and this was all, we're drilling horizontal, we're getting better at the fracs, right? And then when you look at 17 and 18, it was up like 20% and 18%. And everybody was kind of like, oh, well, we're getting really good, it's declining. Well, what was really interesting is if you yank Exxon drilling and Chevron drilling out of 17 and 18, it was at the wells were actually up like 3% and 1%. And the thought behind yanking Exxon and Chevron out, they were just late to the game drilling horizontals in the Permian, and they had the best rock. So arguably your increased step up due to Exxon and Chevron was just great rock was being thrown in. It's not like there were improvements in the well. And so I always thought we were going to fall off the cliff sooner than we have, but we just haven't.
I know.
I can't do the math. I used to, my whole career, I was able to do the math just like you were of how many rigs out we're going to look like this in 6 months. And I can't do it in my head anymore. Yeah,
I think, but Permian, they've had a little productivity spurt in the last couple of years, right? So, they're still not as productive as Bakken and some other places, but you are seeing, I know the DPR showed that the first month production in the Permian has come off. So there's a lot of warning signs out there. I agree.
Yeah. Interesting. So basically what we've been chatting about is similar to you looking for volunteers. Potentially, what's the supply? Where are we going to get it? And we're worried about our supply in oil. So if we're an investor, are we long oil next 2 to 3 years? Are we sitting on the sideline watching this?
It's an interesting time because we can see demand met by OPEC, right? So if we need another 700,000 barrels, that, the way that I forecast is I assume that OPEC's going to come in to balance the market for the next couple of years. However, having spent a long time with the leaders of OPEC, they also want higher prices. And so they're going to be slow to bring that supply there. They're going to drizzle it into the market as needed to balance the market, but they're not going to fall for the same kind of pressure that they have been under in the past, where Trump was saying bring back NOPEC and things like that. They kind of feel that they won this battle because they have been a stabilizing influence. So I would expect that you do see them, put some supply back in the second half of this year and put some supply back in next year, but nothing that sends the market back into the 60s. I think we have a new range now, and that range is a range that is a friendly one to U.S. producers. So, I think the last thing we want is to see a spike up to $120, $140 again, because that has been met in almost every occurrence by people thinking, okay, well, that's going to cause a recession. Prices are too high. That'll kill demand. So you just want to see this kind of slow and steady grind higher, into this kind of, maybe it is 105, but it's, and that an inflation adjusted basis, that's not unrealistic, right? A lot of it's going to depend on, if U.S. refineries can get their acts together and keep products well supplied, which has been a challenge. But so seeing a slow move higher into the 90s, I think is the sweet spot for producers, not to have to be thinking about geopolitical risk and seeing these big volatility spikes.
Yeah. Early in my career, one of the old oil guys out in Midland, when I was there at the Petroleum Club for lunch, said, "Oh, hell, it only matters what the Saudis think when they wake up." Nothing we do matters. But so I guess kind of final question on oil.
Yeah, but the U.S. is now the largest producer, hands down, right? Way above Saudi at this point, because they're down at 9 million just because of cuts, and they've, said that their spare capacity, they're not going to expand it. So it's going to be 12. So we're still the largest producer. It's a very different place now.
Yeah. No, that, although I will say this, for years when I was fundraising, I would say the Saudi spare capacity is not real. I mean, you look at the number of rigs running in the kingdom, and they're not right. You're not getting real information, but just relatively speaking, for a while they were running 2 and 3x the rigs they normally run. Today, their spare capacity is real.
Yeah.
I mean, they demonstrated that they could run at 12, and they didn't do it for that long.
Yeah. I also think their transparency has increased dramatically. They've asked for more transparency from others, and I think they've been much more transparent with their information.
Oh, that's interesting. So kind of last question on that. Does this election, Biden-Trump, matter to oil?
I mean, a couple of the people that were there last night, I was asking them the same question, and they said their lives will be better if Trump comes back in, just because of permitting, and everything just works easier in the oil and gas space domestically.
Yeah. I actually, I hope my girlfriend's not listening, because she's very anti-Trump, and I'm a libertarian. I'm not a huge Trump fan, but I will say, just trying to be objective, it actually seemed like they were doing good things in the Middle East. I mean, they had 4 agreements signed between Israel and Arab countries. It felt like the Saudi-Israel pact was going to happen.
But that's really been under Biden that they're pushing that. That's really been much more recent that they're trying to get all.
Make all the jokes and throw all the stones at Jared Kushner. But, the rumor I've heard is that he and MBS actually get along really well. And that was a lot of the reason the agreements were signed, back under Trump. And do you know where their bonding came from? Supposedly they spend hours playing Call of Duty together. This is true. I've actually heard this. I don't know if you've heard this, but literally hours they would spend playing Call of Duty, like 2 frat boys. And that was a lot of the reason. So
in my experience, I think the relationship started off very strong, but I think it did deteriorate when Trump was constantly calling for NOPEC legislation. I mean, there was definitely a pushback.
That strained it. Yeah.
There was definitely a pushback.
Yeah, and I guess, does Trump try to take Iran barrels off the market?
Right.
I think that would be the other thing, and kind of who knows there.
And the whole irony about Iran and Saudi in the Middle East is that they all get together for these OPEC meetings. They all send their representatives. They all work together. Iran's in the room. Their oil minister is there every time, and they all work out a plan. And despite all of their geopolitical tensions, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, that is great. Well, y'all two were very cool to come on. I appreciate this.
Have Jess give one last.
Give us kind of the last commercial, the last
exactly
the last push, because the beauty is Kathleen and I can always be wrong, and a year from now spin a story
exactly, but you'll look like the star.
Yeah.
Well, I think as Kathleen said, with the season that we are predicted here in the Atlantic hurricane, I hope that the people listening, when they see something, we always hope that it doesn't happen, but if something happens and you see it on the TV or on the news, we hope that you think of All Hands and Hearts, whether that's for a donation or to volunteer.
Yeah. And so All Hands
and Hearts.org.
And Hearts.org.
Yeah.
Reach out there.
Yeah, someone say it with an American accent, because people misunderstand what I said.
People spell it.
Yeah.
But it is, I think we said this once before, but, first responders come in and they make sure that people are safe and have access to healthcare and housing, but then they leave. And then the cleanup and the reconstruction is left to organizations like ours. And it's so important to people's livelihoods to be back in their homes.
Yeah.
No. It's a really
all around the world,
point.
Not just in the U.S., but in, the Philippines, in Mexico, in Nepal.
Yeah, and it was, I think the Katrina hurricane was a wake up to the United States that, hey, it can happen here too. I mean,
and you think that people are going to have insurance and their houses are going to get rebuilt, or FEMA's going to step in, but it just doesn't work that way. There's a lot of people out there that are underinsured and that, don't know how to work the system to get reimbursed and just are then homeless. And look at Maui. I mean, we're working in Maui right now. These just terrible disasters happen every place. And all these people are without homes.
Yeah. So
that's a great point. Maybe don't wait for the next big disaster because there
There's
are people today
in
in Florida that we're helping from Hurricane Ian 2 years ago. So even when you don't see the things on the news, there's people behind the scenes that have been forgotten that need help too. So.
Hey, Yates kids, we're going to go to Hawaii this summer. By the way, pack a hammer.
Exactly. No, the equipment's there. Don't worry.
The equipment's there. That's right. You said all we got to do is show up.
Bring some work shoes.
Yeah, closed-toe shoes. That's all you got to bring.
You were great to come on. I really appreciate it.